Good morning. Boy, is this a dead audience. Let's try that again. Good morning. Good morning, teacher. There we go. Remember, I come from a university. We're supposed to get responses in the morning. Otherwise, you don't get a good grade. This panel is called, tersely, Route Filtering Panel. That's content-free. So I was trying to give a little bit of context, but basically, it has been rumored that certain ISPs filter route advertisements. Don't imagine that anybody ever had heard about that before, but we want to talk a little bit about that in the light of the discussion started relative to a topic on the mailing list relative to microallocations. A small number of you were at the microallocation BOF last night. But for those who weren't, it was small allocations, long prefix allocations for special things like root name servers and the like that would run afoul of the filtering that some ISPs are rumored to do on prefixes. Now note that we have to dance a little gently here. There is a significant antitrust issue relative to talking about things that individual ISPs may do for their own reasons, and dancing a little close to, well, maybe we as a community should do X or Y. That's called collusion, and since I'm standing up here and my errand insurance wouldn't cover it, please don't do that. So what I want to do is to ask each of the panelists to let us know what their ISP does in this area as what do you do, why do you do it, not inviting others to join, just this is informational, and then open the floor to questions. You don't have a microphone, so I don't know. Anyway, so want to start with you. Start over there. Well, we got pictures here, so we'll start with the guy with the pictures.
Randy Bushferrio. Actually, a lot of the motivation of this started from a, shall we say, discussion on the NANOG list that occurred when somebody who had a /16 split it up into two /17s and found that people on Vario's network were unable to reach them and vice versa. And of course, Vario is known to be evil. After all, we're trademarking who is. And much discussion ensued, and just because sometimes the essential points get accidentally lost in NANOG mailing list discussions, to put it politely. A couple of us said maybe we should do this as a panel. And essentially, there have been incidents in history, some of them pretty famous, like the 7007 incident and the 129/8 incident, where massive amounts of routes were accidentally leaked to the net and brought down significant parts of it. The 129/8 incident took down two very large providers for units measured in days, nationwide. So the more paranoid of us kind of filter routes based on different criteria. We literally don't talk much about how we do it between us. I don't really know how Danny filters. And there is a website on which our current filtering policy is posted, and if you called our knock, they'd point you to it. I don't know where it is myself, but I do know how to log on. I still remember how to log on to some of our routers. This is actually a very live router. It's, thanks to wireless and everything, yeah, that is a Seattle router. That's its route filtering policy. And here you see the default route being filtered. Here you see a policy that says in A space, okay, only accept a 19, except for these exceptions where we know that Aaron is allocating 20s. Okay, and what you're seeing is we filter based on what we know of Aaron and Ripes, etc., allocation policies. The philosophy is that's what they're giving out, that's what you should be announcing. You shouldn't be announcing more, but we're not filtering on that, although I'll show you a case where we are, actually. And you shouldn't be chopping it up into /24s and spewing it at us either. Okay? B space, and this is where we got in trouble with those folk that slashed it up into 217s, yeah, 2/17s. And currently our policy in C space is we will take 24s in C space. This has varied, there's been much discussion. We know that different providers have been more strict about C space. Currently, we take old C space as you say it. What can you say? Oops, come on. This is actually more running on the router, so, and there's a lot of packets between here and there. We also have the standard filters people have come to expect, and there are RFCs on it, etc. Dropping default route. We don't really want to accept a default route, and dropping loopback and other tasty things like that. The RFC 1918 space, you know, funny little corners, right? Multicast, etc. We also don't accept announcements of exchange point meshes from our peers. And there was some discussion of that at the NANOG back in '97, February NANOG, why we don't do that. And here's a case where we actually reject a very specific route. Whoops! There we go, we blew it, didn't we? Was it up or down? We'll never find it again. There it is. A very specific route because somebody is announcing a route they were not allocated, and we found out because somebody had a Nick Wind, and we refused to listen to it. And that's my song and dance about what and why we do it. And but the bottom line, let me start again, just make it clear, is we believe we are doing this not to carry religion to the network, but to protect our network from bogus announcements. There's a root problem in that BGP is not well authenticated. Anybody can put anything in the routing registries and go look at 1239 entries if you don't believe that. And so we do this to keep from being brought down by the next 7007 or 129/8. And that's my story.
Danny, why don't you
Okay, well, I don't have any audio aids, or video aids, I guess, so I'll just kind of wing this. Basically, we do pretty much exactly what Vario does. I'm Danny McPherson with Quest. We do pretty much exactly what Vario does. We filter based on registry allocations because we think it makes sense. Just one other thing we do that I didn't see Randy mention, which kind of makes sense, I think, is we don't accept advertisements of our routes from our peers. In other words, if we don't allow them to source like routes that are subsets of our solder blocks, our supernets, just because they shouldn't be advertising those. We do have some multi-home customers with some exceptions, and that's something we really like to get around, and that was like part of the Aaron Microboff allocation thing last night, whatever. But that's the reasoning for that. Where we'd really like to go is to a world where we could filter routes from our peers, all routes on a per prefix per AS basis. But I think we're a long way out. To be able to do that and to be able to do the source address-based filtering, presumably with the same policy, so that spoofing wouldn't be an issue interdomain as well, based on some back-end database or some BGP authentication mechanism, I think is the way to go. And until we get there, anyone could take a root name server, most of the way offline, or do pretty much whatever with the BGP route advertisement, which is kind of ugly. So that's pretty much it, I think, as far as why and whatnot. It's pretty much just as Randy said, because we think it's the right thing to do, and if you don't like it, well, it's unfortunate. So that's it, briefly. So.
We specifically do accept subsets of our blocks from our peers because of the multi-home customer. And but I'm not saying Danny's wrong. This does vary widely between major ISPs. I know some do, some don't.
Okay, our other two panelists are here not as ISPs, but as people involved with the registry, as Kathy is as a member of the Aaron Advisory Council, and John is from the RIPE NCC. Because as Larry pointed out, there is an interaction between the registry's allocation policies, which are determined bottoms up through the registry process and all of that, and the filtering that some of the ISPs do. So they're here in case there's questions on registry allocation process. Do you even want to say anything before we open the floor to questions? Okay. Well, floor is open for questions. This is apparently a non-controversial topic.
BJGL unit. This is for Danny McPherson. How do you scale the fact that your multi-home customers are encoded as policy in your filtering?
With regard to accepting subsets?
Yes.
It's not a big issue today. I mean, we have a few customers. No, we have several customers. It's an exception policy, and it's not the norm. And if someone screams loud enough, we will do that because it makes sense. But as a general rule, to not accept our advertisements from our peers, especially the important blocks like our internal name servers and our mail servers and whatnot, is something that we definitely think is right. And it's insane if you don't. If someone could not only break your customers but break your own network by advertising your routes to you, then that could be very ugly. So.
For example, if you have Peter Lothberg as a customer and he has a BGP tunnel to Sweden and then he advertises your route back to you, it's very exciting. Anyway.
Theoretically? Any other questions? Comments?
Well, that's okay. We're now way ahead of, Sue? Yeah, way ahead of schedule. Let me think for a second. We could have Craig talk now, or it's too early to go out for the break. Food won't be there. Craig, let's see. You want to?
Yeah. So the suggestion was made to recap the microallocation block from last night. Since we had so much fun there, we want to do it again. So, Kenneth, why don't you use we can use the fancy mic.
John wants to say something first.
John Crane from the RIPE NCC. We're actually doing a lot of work at actually looking at the routers at the moment, what's actually in the BGP table, and I wonder how many people actually know what they really look like. There's some people here going to give a talk from our organisation this afternoon on some of these projects, and one of them came to me the other day with some information on what's actually in those tables. We could see 82,000 separate prefixes across 7 peers. more than 50% of those are /24s of the prefixes that they see. So we had 44,500 /24 prefixes in the routing tables, which we've got to double check it, but that was quite surprising, and 3,500 /30s. So there are a lot of these small blocks actually being routed. It's not just a small amount, it's a large percentage of what we're actually seeing. So I just wanted to share that. I think people should probably actually go and look at that talk. I'm going to do a nice plug here, and you should actually go and see what these people have got to say. It's quite interesting.
Well, I live near here, and I left my laptop at home, so I don't have my groovy little slides. We had a micro-allocation BOF last night, and basically the premise of the BOF is the Aaron Advisory Council, which I'm on. We recommend policies to Aaron based on the community input and what the members of Aaron think and stuff like that. And one of the things we're getting requested quite a bit is for longer portable blocks. For a number of things, like key infrastructure, however you define key infrastructure. Some customers, companies that are multi-homed think that they need a portable block because they're multi-homed, and that they can't justify a /20, so they really want their little /30 or whatever. And so basically we had a quite lively discussion that lasted 2 hours remarkably about what you as ISPs think of that if we took a block, say, that's a well-known block that could be defined by a net and a mask, and broke it up into some longer allocations that wouldn't be subsumed in a larger site or advertisement. And we didn't come to a lot of conclusions. We had some people who recommended what they thought key infrastructure was. The RADB was one, and NT servers. I can't think of what the other ones were. There are two current micro-allocation policies at Aaron. One is for interconnect point lands, and there's a definition of what an interconnect point is, and that they're not globally routed, but they need to be unique. And for root name servers. Those are the two things that so far we've been able to adequately define in such a way that the legal budget at Aaron wouldn't be expended in a couple days. So that's basically, we know what we discussed, and now the AC is going to go back and discuss it some more. And if you all have any input, we'd love to hear it. Oh, and another shameless plug for the Aaron Open Policy Meeting, April 3rd through 5th in Calgary. Yeah.
I just have one brief question, Jeff Rizzo. I was unable to make the BOF last night, but you may have just misspoken then. Did you say NT servers?
NTP.
NTP, okay.
Sorry. Oh, that was good, huh? Totally unintentional, yet funny.
I think maybe I'd like to stress why people want microallocations. I wasn't at the BOF, but a lot of other people here also weren't. And I would have liked to have been. Pardon? So it's the ignorant speaking to the ignorant. It's essentially there are people whose business it is to run, for instance, a single-point web farm of some significance. They are multi-homed to multiple providers, I guess and they maybe are even so kind to the rest of the world as to run HTTP 1.1 and stick to it so they don't justify a /8 worth of address space for their 500,000 customers. And therefore, they could do quite happily with /24 of address space, but they need a globally routable /24. And there are large ISP Nazis like Vario, etc., who won't listen to that route because it's not something that the registries allocate. And what some of these providers have said is, look, we have customers with seemingly legitimate needs for this kind of space, And if the registries, for instance, were to take one specific address range and use it for these kind of allocations, then we could not filter on /20, but rather filter on /24 or whatever in that range. And those people would probably, we can't collude on it, we can't, but I know Verio would do it, and other large providers have said they would. And that would let those people have globally routable address space that is small, hence the term microallocation. Now the problem and the pushback is that how do you identify justifiable needs? How do you tell the difference between an NT server and an NGP server? Okay. And then there are those of us who don't understand why root servers and NTP servers need special space anyway. But there are people with content especially that do seem to be able to motivate some need in this area.
From the AC, the difficulty that the Aaron AC is having with this is how do you define a web server of significant whatever? So maybe we can identify the ones that we know we think are significant, but everybody thinks that their site or their business or whatever is significant. And so if we could put some sort of definition around it and bounds around it that could actually be measured or enforced or whatever, then, it would be easier.
Well, your definition of last night was good. Porn is important. But getting more refined than that is a little harder. So we've had this overview of the microallocations BOF.
I think I was unable to make the allocation block last night as well. I had a real job. I've got to go run a network. But speaking from my presentation yesterday, and this is John Brown with iHighway, there's 250 million people out there. There are large numbers of rural internet service providers that need to look at improving service in their community, and by doing that they need to multi-home, but yet they're not able to justify Aaron's current /20 requirements or even more grandiose /19 requirements to get in there. They're just fat, dumb, and happy with a /23 or a /22, and that's all they're ever going to need. We really need to consider these businesses that are providing services, and I'm going to use a political term here, and please don't throw anything at me. The digital divide, it's a very hot topic within commerce, and it's a very hot topic within the Western Caucus of states from a congressional and other point. And these ISPs that are sitting in, let's say, Clovis, New Mexico, that have 2,700 dial-up customers, they serve Cannon Air Force Base, et cetera, they're happy with a /22 or a /23, and that's what they need to be able to provide service. And I'm speaking of a specific example. He has a DS1 to me, and he's running a DS1 to Lubbock, Texas as his multi-home. But because he gets his IP space from me right now, he's going to have to punch a hole in that CIDR block and announce it out. And then I'm going to have to punch a hole in my CIDR block and announce his more specific so that it's a little bit better routable as far as prefix link is concerned. I would strongly encourage the AC, and also speaking as an Aaron member, I would strongly encourage the AC to certainly at the first step look at ISPs on the geographical or other types of demographic information to determine whether or not a microallocation is reasonable for these kinds of internet providers. I don't think it's going to kill the route tables, and I think it's going to improve service for a large population in our country. Thank you.
It sounds like the ideal topic for the Aaron open policy meeting. This is exactly what that meeting is all about.
It's Calgary, April 3rd through 5th.
In case you didn't get that before.
She knows it, if you want to buy it.
Kathy, do you get commissions on tickets for that?
No, I
Okay.
just think it would be great to have these discussions with ISPs and the members of Aaron, that's all.
Aaron very carefully established this open policy meeting. relatively recently. We only had one before this. And it is for the purpose of discussing issues of this type. The Aaron Board is not in the position to determine these kind of policies ad hocly. We want to do it with community input, and this is a very important topic and should be discussed in an open way.
Hi, my name is Tim Chianini. I'm with Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter Online. There's another force that's actually driving down the need for larger targets, let's say. There are products like Resonate, Local Director, by which a very small allocation is a target, and behind it is the larger address space. On top of that, the talk about reverse proxying, all of these methods actually bring down the need of a large CIDR announcement, although the need for that CIDR announcement to be multi-homed is very high. So you have two different forces working against each other, and I just don't think that, and it's probably the reason for this discussion, is that the policies are adhering to a lot of the movement within the industry.
Does anybody have any input about what you think this is going to do to your routing tables and the number of paths you're going to get, and whether you're concerned about these sorts of allocations affecting your network?
We have somebody else on the microphone over here.
I didn't see. Go ahead.
Hi, Dan Golding from Mindspring. One point I wanted to make was that I think it's going to be very problematic to take a parochial view and say these sites are important and these websites are not important. And in this geographical area, we'll make an exception to our multi-homing policy, and in this big city, we won't. Perhaps we need to take a step back and get rid of some of our preconceived notions and say maybe /20 isn't working for multi-homing policy anymore. Maybe our router CPU and memory have to some degree deep-sixed our concerns about routing table size, but our IPv4 address space depletion still, of course, is an issue, and no matter how big or bad we make our routers, that's always going to be an issue. So perhaps one thing we need to consider is we need to think about the e-commerce sites. We need to think about the fact that transit's getting a lot cheaper, and that more and more of these e-commerce companies are becoming multi-homed, with no chance of ever possibly justifying a /20 of address space. We need to think about the rural ISPs. Perhaps we need to get to the point where we do have a block of /24 globally routable IP blocks where there's a set of technical requirements that are completely removed from any political consideration, any subjective consideration by your organization, any geographical consideration at all.
Hi, Jennifer Katinsky, ISP Channel. I guess there's a couple things that I've seen so far in watching the routes and what I would call the moving to the question of using /20, broadcasting /20. One of the things that I do see, we're a small ISP, and we do have a lot of people who, like you said, are in the lower blocks. We try and give out as much of our address space as we can, but we've been finding ourselves that we actually have to go and get address space from the larger providers that provide us our infrastructure in some cases. And what I see going on, where we're trying to get the routing tables to be a lot smaller, which is a good thing, we seem to be sort of favoring the side of the larger ISPs and those people who can allocate such large blocks. And I question, like we've discussed with some of these rurals and also some of the other smaller people, where do we decide that we start squeezing out the small people? When we start getting to, /24, I can understand, with the comment that was made with that there are /30s of what, 3,500, is that correct? At that point, you're looking at how would that kind of routing table get us a significant size, a lot of routes to push out there, and a heck of a lot of overhead on the routers. But when you look at it from a perspective of who's going to aggregate those routes for those people, that's my question back to the committees. Who's going to do those aggregations?
I have a question about the question Kathy, right, asked. My name is Boyakil, I'm with Plurus. How much are you concerned with the routing table size? I mean, if you look at the latest generation of routers that are either out there today or are coming out, I mean, they are capable of handling a lot more than 85,000 routes in a stable manner. So, I mean...
There's going to be a talk just after the break this morning on some measurements and some calculations on the impact of routing table size, routing table dynamics, and AS path length and things like that. It would be good to have the discussion that you're speaking of in the context of some concrete information.
I'll do that, but what I want to point out that is for developments for the future, I think we should base our assumptions on what will be available then versus what is available now. I mean, and that's the only point I wanted to make.
I think it's a very valid point, just to I agree with you on that. There are routers there, the next generation routers are all saying 250,000 routes mumble. But note that, as you will hear later on today, it's not simply a matter of memory space or processor speed. It's a combinatorial problem. The bigger the routing table, the more often it changes, the more often you have to do processing. The more processing you have to do, not linearly, but more than that. You've got additional path information you're going to store, and you've got all this additional information you've got to move around the network. It's not a simple answer, but certainly the current generation, next generation routers are better than the ones that were available when RFC 2050, which was the current allocation policy, was determined, and policy should be determined based on what we think we're going to have, rather than what we did have. So I completely agree. Kathy?
I actually have a comment about that as well. From the Aaron Advisory Council perspective, though, I mean, sure, I work for an ISP, but we're coming to the community and saying, how do you feel about this? Because it's not necessarily, the group of us aren't necessarily going to be able to make the judgment call about whether you're going to be able to replace all of your, Cisco 7500s at every interconnect when we turn this policy on, or whether there's going to be space for them, or whether you're going to have the budget for it, and all that sort of stuff. So as an organization that serves the community by handing out address space, we want to make sure that you understand what we're thinking about and that we get input from the community. So that's more of a question for this group, and that's why, I can tell you what I think as an ISP, but that may not be what you think.
Okay.
Randy wanted to say something.
Yes, the next generation of routers can take larger routing tables, but even though our equipment depreciates faster than 32 feet per second squared, that still is still finite time. So there are folk with that don't have next generation routers out there, and if I sat here with large fancy routers and advocated policies which put at a disadvantage those people who didn't have large fancy routers, I think we would have some comment on that, and that comment would be justifiable. But to get back to the base question, to argue the other side of my point, is you want to add 10 or 30,000 more routes for a good justifiable reason, yeah, we can eat them. Go for it.
Once again, John Brown, iHighway. One is, one of the things I've talked to a lot of the rural ISPs about, and I appreciate that the Aaron policy meeting is in Calgary, Canada, as opposed to places where a lot of these rural ISPs can afford to travel to. I think one of the things that we see is how do we get that input into Aaron in a more direct fashion, and how does that information really review? Because when I look at the AC, I don't necessarily see the small provider well recommended or well.
The AC is the AC is elected by the membership, so please nominate
I
people.
understand that, and we can get into the whole membership a whole membership, the whole membership issue, but the real question here is the fact that a lot of the small ISPs don't see a value from Aaron that causes them to want to become a member and go spend that money to get
Well,
their
no,
input in there.
no.
And we're not going to go down that road.
There's no extra money to be a Aaron member if you're getting
$500 a year.
No,
You're
if you
getting
get-
address space from Aaron, you're a member.
I understand that, but if we're not doing micro allocations, then how do they become a member?
There's an open mailing list.
We've struggled with this for years from the RIPE NCC perspective. It's outreach. You have to go out there and tell people that these policy meetings are taking place, and more importantly, that the mailing lists are there. And they can give input. I mean, you're not going to reach everybody, but you can reach a lot of people if you actually reach out to them and say, get on these mailing lists.
Agreed, and I think my summary statement there is that Aaron needs to do far more outreach to the community than what it's doing today.
Okay.
Here we are.
Two things. We are here, well, three things, okay. We are here doing some outreach. And two, the reason the meeting is in Calgary, Canada is because a kind soul in Calgary, Canada offered to host it. And so if you're willing to host a meeting in one of these rural areas, I'm sure that we'd be more than willing to have the meeting there.
The
And
offer has already
third-
been extended.
All right, great. You can talk to Kim. The other thing is that the AC members are nominated and elected by the membership, and you don't have to be a member to be elected to the AC. So if you feel that there's somebody in one of these locations who wants, you want to have on the AC to represent these folks, then nominate them, and, they have just as good a shot as anybody else.
The other point as far as route table issue and what Scott said about the growth and so forth is in fact a very important and valid thing. But I also sit back and I wonder why are some providers out there taking, let's say, 63/8 in their various assignments out of there and de-aggregating them down to the /24 level, or I think I saw Net 12 was doing a lot of that recently as well, which is injecting a lot of routes into the world. We could probably help clean some of that up. And that would help.
I don't see those routes.
He filters them. Okay.
You read bad books, you read bad books. Your choice.
Okay.
Hi, Wayne Bouchard, currently representing nobody.
And doing a
myself,
fine
please.
job, too.
With the comment that was made over there in the response from the panel, I want to point out that these days that as far as number of routes in the routing table goes, that overall size and memory allocation is no longer necessarily the primary issue, but as I pointed out, it's processing size and instability. The more routes you add in there, the greater the odds are that something is going to go wrong. And I think that's something that needs to be considered. The ideas behind filtering and behind Aaron's policies of /19/20 or whatever is not to shrink the routing table size, but rather to lessen the rate of growth. And that, I think, is a more important point to consider there, to realize that it's going to get bigger. We just have to get a handle on it and make sure that we understand what's going on. With respect to filtering against Aaron's allocations, I'm going to encourage a slight modification to that, because there are organizations out there that are attempting to do some reasonable implementation of geographical med-based distributions of their net blocks. So somebody may get a /13 and split it up into some /16s and advertise those to their peers to try to encourage a best entry policy. And filtering against the entire block doesn't permit that. Now, by the same token, those people who split that up would be fools to not also source the original /13, because that's what they got. It says to the rest of the network, this is my block, it's advertised for my network, if you want to get to it, you come to me. It also allows compensation for those who are going to filter against the registry, plus the fact that if part of your geographic allocations suddenly disappear off the network, well, the traffic doesn't get black holed there, it gets black holed in your network, which at least gives it a chance of getting through in the first place.
Thank you.
Kathy?
Yes, Rob?
Yeah. What kind of support have you gotten for the backbones listening to the smaller blocks when they do get proposed? I mean, when they,
You mean from the BOF last night?
yeah.
I think that I'd hazard to say that we had consensus, but there certainly were a number of people that felt that if there was a defined policy and it was in a bounded block, that you know, they sort of thought that was okay, but defining the policy is the issue, and deciding what length and that sort of stuff is really the hard part about it. But if we could actually do that, then, you know, they seem to be, you know, in favor of that. No, I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm just hoping that everybody will adopt it, rather than some people saying, well, we thought we had the space on our routers to afford it, and all of a sudden we can't, and so they decide to filter back the old ways again.
Well, note that, as I said at the very beginning, we can talk about information about what people can use for their own decision processes, but as a community, we can't make decisions about things like this, because there are antitrust issues about, everybody agreeing on this is not the process we can do. We can do what we've heard from the ISPs here. They take the registry's policies as part of their decision process on how they decide things. Other ISPs may or may not. They're not here to say.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying we're trying to force anything. I'm just trying to say, are people agreeing, are people giving support?
Certainly, the thing I could see happening, right, is that right now, if you're dual homed and you advertise the longer prefix, it's subsumed within an aggregate that's reachable and routed anyway. So if somebody filters it, they can still get to you. In this world, there'd be a block, and if somebody filtered the block, they couldn't get to any one of the folks in the block. But conceivably, they could charge you if you wanted them to listen to your advertisement. But, I don't know what people in the room would do, and we certainly can't suggest that. But,
There was a beautiful rat hole last night about charging for rat.
yeah, it's a huge rat hole.
So it's like,
Charge for rat holes.
yeah. We'd be rich by now.
Actually, that brings up can I just one more? Since you brought up the issue of charging, I mean, there are people like us who, obviously, we don't care about money, but...
That's web TV, by the way.
But, you have the rurals who will say, I can only afford so many charges to advertise so many smaller blocks, and then what do I do after that point?
Charge your customers more, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
That's just economic system. That's the whole point of this wonderful method of just charging for route advertisements. It's the marketplace decides whether you think your information is valuable enough. We'll see. Actually, over here.
Hi, Patrick Gilmore from Onyx Networks. I didn't meet the BOF last night, and I think everybody here probably knows my views on deaggregation in smaller blocks. But
I don't.
Okay, well, then you missed my BOF last NANOG. But I noticed that Danny and Randy both allow smaller blocks through their filters when somebody multi-homes. And most of the other large networks that I know about, like UNet and Sprint, don't filter on large blocks, they filter on /24s, at least that I've seen. And I noticed that when somebody multi-homes, a lot of times they're told by Aaron, they go to their provider, they get a small block, 24, 23, maybe a 22, and they announce it out both sides. And then when they move, they have to give that block back and renumber and whatnot. And that means that holes and filters and whatnot have to churn as well as the routing table itself. I would rather Aaron just give somebody who multi-homes a /22, a /23, and I can look in Aaron and find out who it came from, why it's there, who owns the route, et cetera, et cetera. And when they change providers, their route doesn't change, and I don't have to change my filters, et cetera. So since everybody's already accepting those sub-allocations by your own admission when somebody multi-homes, I'm wondering what objection there is to giving a micro-allocation of a 23 or a 22, something reasonable to somebody who's multi-homing, so that we can at least nail it down and don't have to change our filters every time they move.
Well, I don't know if this is an objection, but certainly if it's subsumed in a larger block, I can just listen to the larger block and still be able to get there. Whereas if it's an independent allocation, I have to listen to it. And I have a question for you. So if you're only you're putting an entry in for this block and you know who it's coming from and you never have to change it, how many of those are you willing to tolerate into your filters before your router rolls over?
Actually, I just filter on 24s and let anybody announce anything they want, so that's fine.
Okay.
But As far as accepting the larger block, then that implies, for instance, if Randy gives somebody out of his /16 or /12 or whatever, a 24, and he punches in his filter, and I'm listening to only the larger block, then Randy's giving that guy transit, even if he's got a better path through some other provider. So we increase performance. Randy doesn't have to, sorry, I don't mean to use Vario as an example.
I'm used to being picked on at school.
Yeah, and you should be used to it by now. And
There's no problem with him being able to deal with that.
yeah. And his network is now assuming the entire burden for that, which may or may not be something that he wants, but I'd rather the customer get the best possible performance. So if he's multi-homed and, it's 5 AS hops through me and 2 AS hops through somebody else, I want it to go the other way, even if I own the cider.
Okay, I have one more question for you. So, okay, you're saying that this would be allocations for dual-homed?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and how would you define, because this is, the gist of this whole thing is that, how do you define dual-homed? What criteria would you use to determine whether somebody who's dual-homed gets one or doesn't get one?
I would actually, and obviously this is sort of off the cuff, so there might be objections, and that's what I'm asking for, but I would actually define it as anybody who has 2 separate paths through the internet. If you have 2 upstream ASs and you have your own AS and can source that route from your AS, it can be reached from 2 separate upstreams, or a peering route at a peering NAP, for instance, that should be good enough. At least that's how I feel about it. There's plenty of objections, and that, of course, leaves alone the people who are single-homed and things like that. But at least for that subset of people, which is a finite and relatively small subset compared to the whole internet, I don't understand why we don't go ahead and give them 23s or whatever.
Microphone?
To that, I'd like to say that once you begin doing that, then not only are IP address allocations an issue, then you run out of AS numbers quickly.
Yeah, there's only 17 million/24, so.
Actually, we give them AS numbers whether we give them an allocation or not if they can prove they have 2 upstreams. So the running out of AS numbers becomes a non-issue.
Well,
It's a little hard in the 66,000.
It's not relative to this conversation. I mean, if we run out of AS numbers, it's going to happen whether we give them micro-allocations or not.
Right, I mean, I have an AS number and I don't have an allocation, so.
Okay.
Well, you're up next anyway.
Yeah, I want to say briefly, we hashed this over for 2 hours last night, so there's no sense recapitulating the entire argument. Rob Zarko from Chelsea Data. But, there was an off-the-cuff mark made about charging for space, and that's not what the argument was. The argument was that, if I can summarize it this way, decisions about what routes to listen to are not a technical decision. Decisions about what routes to listen to are a business decision. Everyone in this room would like to think that they will choose good technical criteria for what routes they listen to, and that management at the respective companies will listen to that. But the bottom line is that the number of routes in your routing table is a finite resource. We can argue about why and how fast that resource is growing, but it is finite. And at some point, you have to make a decision about how many routes you can handle and which ones you don't listen to. And you're going to do that based on what's important to your customers. If Vario, for example, decides that listening to the /24 for one of my POPs that we announce as a backup route, if they decide that's not important and that connectivity to my dial-up customers isn't important, that's a business decision that Vario is making. And we can argue about whether that's good or bad, but their shareholders ultimately will decide that, and their customers will decide that. I think the problem that I'm hearing here is really just one of coordination. Again, what was expressed, Randy expressed earlier, was that the reason that they filter based on allocation boundaries is to protect themselves from routes getting black holed and so on. And that's a problem that can be addressed in other ways, whether through routing registry or what have you. And I think rather than trying to say we need to come up with set aside some space for microallocations, we might want to say, let's create a coordination mechanism for being able to know what shorter routes are valid and which aren't.
I'd like to say something to that. I think that, like with the micro allocations even, the number of routes that are being advertised, if someone's multi-home to 2 or 3 or 4 networks, that's 2 or 3 or 4 paths, 3 or 4 or 5 times in my routers at the edges of my network. And yeah, I have big routers, but then again, I have, hundreds of thousands of paths in some of my routers today. And ideally, I'd be able to prefix filter in a domain and not allow someone to advertise a route to me that they're not the originating AS or somewhere in, a transit AS for that prefix. And, the larger the numbers of paths, well, I don't know any router today, or, I've seen a few router vendors that, what they have coming, and I don't know of any just yet that are actually going to be able to, to prefix 300,000, 400, or prefix filter 400,000 routes on BGP updates from, a couple of hundred peers. So I think that's an issue as well.
Randy?
I have to totally agree with your opening statement. This is a useless rat hole. There's a lot of history behind proving it's useless, well, not proving it, but demonstrating it time and time again. There has been no formal proof. Well, we can work on it. But the fact is, I'm spending a significant amount of my time this week filling out a Department of Justice civil information form. And I don't intend to fill out more based on collusion with other ISPs and allocators to say what I will and will not and suggest what they do and do not filter. I do it based on what I think gives my customers the best service, and that's it.
John Curran, I'm also on the Aaron board. I'm going to try to keep it very simple. We know that allocations to organizations from ISPs, generally hierarchical, don't create new demands for routes. We know allocations from registries do in many cases because they're not hierarchical. And basically the question we all have to face is, how many routes do we want to face that aren't part of an actual hierarchy? And who gets them? Okay? And there's a lot of folks who believe that there's social causes that should get them. I've personally heard pleas for rural America. I've heard pleas for small schools. I've heard pleas for large schools. I've heard pleas for, big business, small business, random countries. The end-all, be-all here is that we have to decide how many routes we really want to have in the routing table. We have to set policies so that the registries end up with a number of allocations out there that aren't significantly different from the order of magnitude of routes we can handle. The way this is all done is 2 methods. One is you actually elect folks on the RNAC who have views similar to your own, or if you're more involved, you show up at the open policy meeting and speak those views. This isn't really a hard question. The question is, how many routes beyond the hierarchy are we going to carry, and how are those going to be assigned?
Carl Rummond, UNET Canada. I think one of the things that we're mixing up here is that allocation policies and filtering policies are completely separate. What certain ISPs choose to filter is a business decision. It has nothing to do with what's allocated. And as a result, if in the case of John or other ISPs who are smaller providers who do want to get multi-homed, you can get blocks from your upstream that you can announce out. Now, some of the companies in the internet may not listen to that, some companies may not allow that, and at the end it's really market forces who will really allow that.
Thank you.
I think to that real quick, to echo what Randy was saying, that is from a business perspective, if my route filtering, I'm speaking just for Quest here, if my route filtering increases the availability of my customer, connectivity to destinations, then it's as much a business decision.
I have a comment as well. Certainly they're independent, but they are related, filtering policy and address allocations. And certainly Aaron slid the bit from a 19 to a 20, independent of the existing filtering policies, and, hoped that, it would all work out in the end. But as one of the first folks to get an allocation out of Net24 on a very large service provider, only listen to 24/8, I'm well aware that the policy allocating Hardesty 24 and ISP filtering unrelated. And we want to understand how this is going to we treat the policy as not being good, but we really negligent. So that we're not headed out, and we might not have the network, but we don't think it's going to happen. So we're trying to set a balance.
Microallocation from, well, what's going to happen, to clarify that, is they're going to take, let's say I'm a downstream ISP and I give them a class 23 and they go to Frontier Global. They're going to announce the 23 to Global, and I'm going to announce my 20, but their 23 is always going to win because it's more specific. So I'm going to announce my 23 so that it sort of balances out a little bit. We could argue the merits of that if we want to. But it does happen. And I think the real thing is that the ISP, that small ISP, that microallocation, would like to have the ability to move or change their provider without having to go through the pain of renumbering. We're already pushing the stuff into the route table anyway, so does it make that much of a difference from a routing table's perspective if we go ahead and do that microallocation? The other point, and I'll say real quick, as far as charging for route space, or charging, or some sort of a settlement system, I'd love to see that work, but I don't think it will anytime reasonable. The thing there is that Macy's wants to be able to sell those fur coats to somebody sitting in Taos, New Mexico, and Macy wants to be able to get to that ISP in Taos, New Mexico, so that they can get that commerce. So one part of it is instead of charging the edge ISP, you may incorporate that into your overhead or overall cost perspective as far as getting these smaller routes put out there. And that's sort of, I'm coming off the cuff with that thought, and it probably needs to be cooked more. But anyway, just as far as the route table stuff is concerned, the ISP is going to get at least 2 routes pushed out there in many cases anyway. What does the allocation policy have to do with respect to that?
Well, Macy's fur coats are ruining Taos. So get that crap out of Taos.
Agreed.
Wool is better.
It's, for sure. I'm not even sheepish about it. I don't want to go down the rat hole of settlements and, the people will do what's best for their business.
Yes, agreed.
If it's best from our business to aid and abet Macy's selling fur coats to Taotians, then that's life in the big city.
Right.
I do want to read a comment here. Somebody said, Randy, if you're still on the panel while you get this. It's from Daniel Sene. The issue I have with route filtering is determining you're running into trouble with it. This is a good point. I've had occasion in the past to have someone filter a route incorrectly, but then have a very tough time determining that this was indeed the cause of the trouble. And it would be very helpful to have some sort of policy or place to look up information to debug such a problem. And I have to fess up, I also have a piece of email from one of my NOC people pointing out that I was being disingenuous when I said I didn't know where our policies publicly posted. I'm just not going to quote URLs here, but possibly some, I think a bunch of us would send our URLs stating our policies, or I would see that Verio sent a URL to where you can find what our current policy is to NANOG to put up on a NANOG collection or something like that.
Yeah, we'd love it if someone actually has a page.
I think there's a point up there where there's some that should be already there.
Okay, we're,
How much are you,
Wait, I have a comment. One thing that we try really hard to avoid is allocating based on people's desire not to have to readdress. And I think that, I don't know what people in the room feel, but I have to readdress continually, and I'd like to apply for those addresses for those million cable modems that are currently out of intent, because I have to readdress them continually. So I think that, I don't know, I'd actually like to know what people think, but having to readdress, I know it's difficult, but if we base allocation policies on that, then everybody's going to have portable blocks.
okay, I want to thank the panel for their input and the floor. Thanks very much.